1990s and early 2000s, there was an actor by the name of Robert Downey Jr. You'd recognize him here. Many of us have been fans of his work for a long time. He was one of the most talented actors in Hollywood, again, late 1990s, early 2000s, but there was one aspect of trouble that he was dealing with, and that was addiction. He was battling addiction for years at this time, addiction to alcohol and drugs. He had been arrested multiple times. He had lost credibility in various roles with different studios and different aspects of what he could do. He'd completely lost trust among the insiders in Hollywood. And at one point, he even served time in prison. So he'd really gotten at a pretty low point in his career. And by all appearances, Robert Downey Jr.'s career was over. His life trajectory was finished, but then something changed. He began the hard work of recovery, slowly, consistently, quietly rebuilding his life. And when he started to come back, many of the studios really weren't very optimistic about his trajectory until one took a chance on him and they put him in this role, Iron Man. How many people know Iron Man, right? Yeah. The Marvel Studios, in fact, would eventually come to revolve around Iron Man, Robert Downey Jr. And that's really the story of how we went from a low to a high, and it all came to pass because he got a second chance. It restored his career. It redefined it. He went on to become one of the most recognizable, successful actors in Hollywood because somebody gave him a second chance. And Robert Downey Jr. credits the fact that helped him get past those addictions with people around him, encouraging him, putting him in the right places at the right time to overcome that. So I say all of that because that's a great story of recovery and of second chance. But there's an even more famous story, and that's the story of Jonah out of the Old Testament. You know, when Joe said to me, hey, here's the series that we're in, and here's the choices you can have, he gave me first choice of what to have as far as these opportunities, and I said, I want Jonah, because Jonah's a great story. Because when you look at the life of Jonah, he illustrates perfectly this whole principle of a second chance. And his second chance didn't just isn't just about a fish. It's not a story just about a fish. It's about a God refusing to give up on his people. I'll say that again. Jonah is not just a story about a fish. It's about God refusing to give up on his people. A God who doesn't just offer forgiveness, but he restores purpose. And that's what I want to focus on this morning for the brief time we have. That God does not abandon his purpose for us. Even when we run, fail, or fall, he pursues, listens, and restores. And that's the heart of what we're going to talk about here for just a minute in this regard of purpose and each of us in the heart of a second chance. So first off, when we run, God pursues. I love the story of Jonah in that the very first verses set it all up for us. It's a short book in the Old Testament, only a few chapters, but for the very first beginning, you get the sense of what's going to be a lot of drama in this book of Jonah, the story of Jonah. Jonah 1, verses 2 through 3. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, Jonah, because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord. Now, this is an interesting part here in the first few verses. We know this probably from Sunday school or stories we've read or heard from people talking about the life of Jonah. But it's interesting, the very first beginning, you hear here that Jonah is commanded to go and preach to this city of Nineveh. Well, in a historical context, Nineveh was a very wicked city. It was a city that had rejected God. It was a Gentile city, a city of a capital of a nation that was basically wicked and brought fear to the heart of many people because it was a city in many respects and a country in many respects that would devastate their enemies and do just unspeakable things to the people they would capture and bring home basically for torture and basically just terrible culture that lived there. And so I say all of that because Jonah is tasked with going and preaching to them. You can imagine the preacher on the corner of New York City preaching to people, telling them they're going to hell, and hopefully they're going to respond, And yet Jonah's commanded to go and preach, and yet we see there for the first few verses, Jonah turns away and runs away from God. As we know, we're not going to get into all the verses, but we know Jonah goes and gets on a boat, and the boat goes out to sea. And in this passage, we see that that boat is actually headed, if you look on an ancient map, in the exact opposite direction of Nineveh. So Jonah was doing the exact opposite of what God had told him to do. Hey, I want you to go preach to this nation, this city of Nineveh, these wicked, wicked people. And Jonah says, okay, and goes and buys passage on this boat going in the opposite direction. And so Jonah is absolutely running as far away as he could. And it's clear, even though the assignment he's given, he's running in the opposite direction. And I'll point, it's not confusion, it's resistance. Jonah is actually going in the opposite direction. But then when we read in verse 4, a storm comes up. The Lord sent a great wind on the sea. We know from the story that a great storm comes up. And the important thing to notice here is the storm isn't random. God is sending that. And it's not punishment, but it's God's pursuit of Jonah. Notice that God did not forget Jonah. God loved Jonah too much to just let him drift. Now I say all of that because Jonah is running for his purpose that God has given him, the meaning he's given him in life. Do you know that researchers have found in studying Americans throughout the United States, that researchers have found that if you have a meaning and purpose in your life, you're happier. You have a reason to get up in the morning. You have a reason to live day in, day out, versus somebody who doesn't have a purpose, doesn't have a meaning, and they're just kind of living adrift in life. That really, when you have purpose in life, you have meaning in life, it's healthier for you mentally, emotionally, physically, and relationally. That's a healthy state of life to be in when you know what your purpose and your meaning in life is. And for Jonah, he said, that's not what I want it to be. I'm going to go in the opposite direction. I'm going to run as far from that. But each of us have a purpose that God has for each of our lives. And I say that because it's important for us to tune into our purpose. And unfortunately, Jonah went the opposite direction. And so I say that because it is a necessity of human life that we find our purpose, that we find our meaning in life. And yet, that's why running from God is so serious, because when Jonah ran, he wasn't just changing his location, he was stepping away from the very thing that God was giving him to accomplish. Some of us kind of feel that way, I'm sure, at times, not because life is falling apart, because deep down we know we're not where God has called us to be. Maybe we're running from what God has called us to. And we see this storm arise that God sent. I think it accentuates the fact that God did not abandon Jonah in the situation where Jonah was running from God. God didn't abandon from him. In fact, God did not have any distance from Jonah. He still saw him even in his running away from God. And I say that because as an illustration, I think about, for example, a toddler on a playground with his parent. Think about a busy playground. The parent has brought their toddler there to enjoy the playground, to have fun, to play with others, to climb the ladder, to go down the slide, to do all the things you do at the playground. Well, let's say the child begins to walk away from the playground just to explore, and there's a busy road right beside the playground. And as the toddler kind of just walks over in that area and starts taking in things in that direction, the parent swoops in and snatches the child up to rescue them. And it's not meant for punishment. It's meant, though, to intervene in the child going the wrong direction. And sometimes those storms in our life, which we think are abrupt, maybe they're not punishment. Maybe they're meant to intervene, to direct us back to what God's calling us to do. That's what happened here with Jonah. The storm was not there to punish Jonah. It was there to intervene and call him back to the purpose and call him back to God, ultimately. Some of the storms in our lives may actually be God redirecting us in the direction He wants us to go. In saying that, I believe God's pursuit is proof of His commitment to our purpose, to Jonah's purpose, as we see here. Second point is, when we fall, God listens. In Jonah chapter 2, we know kind of how the story progresses, don't we? So what happens here is, when we fall, God listens. But what happens here is in the story, this storm comes up. Jonah's a passenger on this boat, and all the other people on the boat are kind of saying, okay, why is this storm coming up? What has God got against us? Because they can sense there's a heaviness on this boat. Jonah speaks up and says, yeah, it's me. I'm running from God. And so everybody on the boat takes it to point to say, well, what are we going to do? And so they elect eventually to throw Jonah off board because the storm was so bad. That's pretty much what happens. They throw him overboard. They say, God, forgive us, but we're going to get rid of him because you obviously have something up with him. Well, that's part of God's plan, from that standpoint, is they throw him overboard. But here's the interesting, because this is where the story really gets interesting. He's swallowed by a great fish and ends up in the belly of a whale or a great fish. And then in Jonah chapter 2, verse 2, in my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. That's probably one of the most powerful verses in Scripture where Jonah has been running in the opposite direction of where God was calling him, and yet in the midst of his despair, when he reaches the low bottom, like the actor we were talking about earlier, when you get to the lowest low but cry out to God, God hears you. He answered him. In fact, when you thought you were running from God, you really weren't running from him because God was still there beside you the whole time. Even though in your will, your free will, you might be running from him, he's still right there beside you. And that's what we find out in the story of Jonah. He hadn't departed Jonah at all. In this sense, Jonah doesn't just run, he sinks, literally, thrown in the sea, swallowed by a great fish, sitting in darkness. He's hit rock bottom, but Jonah does something crucial. He prays. And what's so powerful about this, God listens. Not when Jonah has fixed everything, not when he's proven himself, but he's still right there at the lowest point, having been running from God. So that's an important aspect to understand here, is that everything wasn't fixed, and Jonah hadn't turned back to God fully, but he was at a point where he just said, God, help me. And God responds. There's an old story of a miner that was trapped underground in an old mine, and it had collapsed, and for hours the rescuers were trying to reach him, and the rescuers decided they were going to bang on the pipes going down in the mine that were covered with rocks. And as they banged on the mine, or the pipes going down, they could hit the metal, and it would reverberate throughout the mine. They were listening for any sign of life, where this miner trapped down there was still alive, and eventually, faintly, they heard tapping on the pipes in return. And that small signal changed everything. It meant that person's alive, they're reachable, they're not forgotten. Folks, prayer is that tap in the darkness for us. At times, tapping and saying, God, I need you at this moment. And God always hears it. God always responds. God always gives an answer. You're never too far gone to call on God. That's what this story tells us. Failure doesn't silence your voice with God. Jonah had run in the opposite direction and failed him miserably. Yet God was right there listening, willing to accept him and bring him back. And the turning point isn't fixing your situation, it's turning your heart to God. That's an important aspect of this. So when we fall, God listens. Well, the third point is, and this is the good news, when we return, God restores. In Jonah chapter 3, we know the story. The fish surfaces and spits Jonah back up on this land, up on the beach, And so Jonah's there in the midst of all this. What a story to tell, right? But my point is here that when he returned, God restores. And so in Jonah 3:1, we read these verses. Then the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. Go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim to it the message I give you. Same God, same calling, same mission, but now Jonah gets a second chance. And God doesn't replace Jonah. He could have found somebody else, but he doesn't. He's tasked Jonah with this message, with this mission. And God uses him in a powerful way. It's amazing to me as what happens to Jonah here. You know how the story goes. He finally embraces it. He goes to Nineveh. He preaches just like that guy on the corner in New York City saying, you're all going to hell, you got to turn back. And Jonah's actually embracing it. He's kind of excited for it at this point, because it says that after he preaches redemption and salvation to these hated Ninevites, he goes up on a hill, and remember what he does? He sits there and he enthusiastically waits. He's waiting to look for fireworks. He wants God to judge them and burn the place down. I mean, that's where he is. That's what he's at. And he's up there, and guess what? The craziest thing happens. The Ninevites repent. They turn to God. And so Jonah's reaction is so funny because he's like, wait a minute, God, you sent me to preach fire and brimstone, and now no fire and brimstone. They turned back to you. What a letdown. It's kind of a crazy moment, isn't it? But you see, again, the cool part here is God is a God of second chances, not for just Jonah, but for the Ninevites as well. That's the beauty of this story, is that turning back to God eases his wrath, allows us to find redemption and salvation through him and his Son, and ultimately finding the purpose and meaning for our lives, which is God-given. How beautiful that is. You know, in my own life, I mean, I was raised as a preacher's kid. My first Sunday was the Sunday after I was born in church, and I've tried to be in church every Sunday since. So, I mean, I was raised in a Christian home, went to Bible college, graduated, went into located ministry. I've been in ministries throughout different churches, North Carolina, Virginia, Georgia. Love the fact that CFR, it's a ministry working with churches. I say all that because I was in a located ministry 25 years ago, and I had made a mistake in church. In leading the church as a lead minister, I'd made a mistake, and it had been easy for the elders to say, hey, you're done. But I remember an elder sitting beside me in the back of the sanctuary one time, putting his arm around and said, I forgive you. We forgive you. And they restored me. And it made all the difference. Because I wouldn't be where I'm at today if they hadn't done that. And I say that for each of us can be restored. You're never so far away that God can't restore you and use you for his kingdom. You're never too far away. Jonah teaches us that. He was at the lowest low. He's in the belly of a great fish. And he prays to God, God save me. And God uses Jonah in an amazing way, the story that is well told even today. You know, our spiritual journey is intended to be one of purpose. If you get nothing else today, I want to really underscore this today, that our spiritual journey is intended to be one of purpose. God's got a purpose for each of us. God's purpose for your life still stands. Your failure may shape you, but it doesn't define you. The question isn't have you failed, it's how are you going to respond when God calls again? You know? Because we all fail. We all fall short, but God uses broken vessels to do his work. We're all broken vessels, but God puts us back together just like the image on the series says there. So God's story reminds us when we run, God pursues. When we fall, God listens. When we return, God restores. That's true to the God of the second chance, isn't it? Hey, I want to share with you, just in closing today, an illustration about a painting. It's an illustration that I believe really accentuates the idea of meaning and purpose in God's kingdom. And so you're going to see right here an image of a painting. Now, I occasionally will go to a museum, look at different paintings and all this, but this particular one struck out to me. Now, this may not be in your wheelhouse as far as preferred painting, okay? I get it. You may say, nope, that doesn't do it for me, Malcolm. But I was intrigued by this style of painting. It's actually a group of painters that came along in Europe after Van Gogh and after Monet. We know all those impressionists where you see all those in the stores at different times, and you see those are such famous paintings. But Monet and Van Gogh and all those different ones were kind of a blurred, kind of not modern art, but one in which you could see just a lot of beautiful brush strokes and things from that, and use of colors and light. But I say that because after Van Gogh and Monet, there was another group that came along, and this group was called the Pointillism group. And Pointillism is where they would take a point of paint and just put a dot, and then another dot, and then another dot, and they would form a painting from all those dots. And they really put a lot of thought and process into what each dot stood for. So here you see dots in blue and green and yellow and pink. You might say, yeah, but Malcolm, it doesn't do anything for me. But what I've done is zoomed in for just a small square inch here. So let's go out to the bigger painting for just a minute. And you see what that painting really is. as they were doing. Now, again, it might not be your type of painting that you like. The thing I really like about it is when you step back, all those points begin to make sense, don't they? You know, you can stare at that one point of green, but as you see down at the bottom, you see that's what they're using for the reflection of the mast on that sailboat there, the large boat there in the middle. All those greens and yellows are the mast reflecting in the water of what he's done. But I can't imagine how many hours it took for somebody to evaluate, all right, what color point am I going to put here? What color point am I going to put there? And they craft this beautiful masterpiece. You can see this painting at the museum, Chrysler Museum in downtown Norfolk. And so that's what really tipped me off to this whole mindset of pointillism in painting, that it's almost like connect the dots, you know, the kind of painting we do as we're toddlers. But in this sense, it's much deeper in that each point of paint, each brush stroke has a purpose, doesn't it? Because if you took all the greens out, that would look awfully different. If you took all the pinks out, it would look awful different. So the reason I'm mentioning that is I believe, listen, last point I'm making today, God is painting a masterpiece in our lives. God is painting a masterpiece, and you and I are part of that masterpiece. Each of us have a role to serve. Each of us have a purpose in life. And yes, it might be a small little pixel, a brush stroke over in the right-hand corner, but without you, it's not a masterpiece. God wants to use you in service and in purpose and in meaning. And guess what? That's what we were made for. That's when we're happiest. That's when we feel most satisfied, when we're part of that masterpiece that God is painting. So I want to challenge you today, search out your purpose and your meaning that God has for you here at Smithfield Christian Church. Seek out the meaning and purpose God has for you in your home. Seek out the purpose and meaning God has for you in your workplace, and fulfill that to the best of your abilities with all of your energies, because that's what God is calling us to do, to find that meaning and purpose in His kingdom and serve Him with vigor and with energy and with passion, so that the masterpiece He's painting comes to life in your life and those around you. I just challenge you with that today. Worship team's going to lead us in a final message. I'll be in the lobby afterwards. If you have a question about CFR or like share with me about something else, I'm there for you. But let's be standing as we wrap up worship today.